Hey, I'm Cameron McKenzie. I'm the editor-in-chief over at theserverside.com, and I want to quickly show you how to create a Hibernate and JPA 3 CRUD application. Now, first thing you need if you want to do CRUD database applications is you need a database. I've got MySQL installed. I'm going to open it up and create a schema called Hibernate examples. That's the first thing you need to do. You need somewhere for your applications to connect to. So I'm going to create that. That's essentially going to be my database. It's going to contain all of the tables, but it's got nothing in there right now. But we'll get to that just a little bit later. But you do need your database. The next thing you need is a project to store all your code. I've got Eclipse here. I'm going to create a Maven project, but you could create a Gradle project if you wanted. I'm going to put the com.mcnz.jpa coordinates in for the group ID, and then I'll just call it examples for the artifact ID and click finish, and then that creates my Maven project. Now there's a couple of things that annoy me about a Maven project, and one of them is the fact that it always defaults to Java 1.5. So I'm going to add these little properties in here to make sure that it's going to work on a Java 17 compliance, which is the minimum requirement for JPA 3. The other thing I need is I need to add a few dependencies. And there we go. And what are those dependencies? Well, one is I need the database drivers to connect to MySQL. So I've gone to MySQL and got connector J coordinates over here, which I will paste in. And well, if we want to use Hibernate, we probably need a Hibernate. So I'm going to get the 6.22 final. That supports JPA 3.1, I believe. I'm going to get those coordinates there, copy them, and throw them in here. I'm going to make them the first one. Not that it matters, but I don't know, kind of some deference there to Hibernate. I'm going to format that, see if it makes it look a little bit prettier. And indeed it does. And there you go. That is your project all set up. Now, one thing you do need to do, I'm going to get rid of this type thing. Instead, I'm going to change it to scope. And the scope is going to be compile. If you don't make that change, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So make sure you make that change for the Hibernate core. Okay, with that done, I believe we are done with our POM file. As always, when you're done with a POM file, click Update Project. You'll see a little bit of a status bar in this window updating things. Then before you put anything in there, I always like to say run as a Maven install and just make sure that everything works when you don't have anything in there. If it doesn't work, you're really in trouble. But there we go. It's just everything's building properly, and that makes me feel good. So what do we do next? Well, if you want to have a JPA project, I'm telling you, something that you've got to have is you've got to have a file named persistence.xml in a folder named meta-inf. So under that resources file, I'm going to create a folder called meta-inf, and then I'm going to create a file called persistence.xml. Okay, we've got that. Now, copy and paste the configuration of a persistence file in here because there's all sorts of version numbers, XSI, XML namespaces, crazy stuff. You'll never get this right. Make sure that it's the persistence 3.0 version that you're using. We'll actually still have access to 3.1 APIs, but the schema has to be 3.0. Make sure you've got information about your database on there. So I'm connecting to MySQL, so I got the MySQL driver, but if you're connecting to Postgres, you're connecting to Derby, you got to use the appropriate driver for that. Same with the database URL. You see that this points to MySQL right here. Well, obviously, if you're using Hypersonic database, that MySQL isn't going to work. I've got my credentials, root, and password here. Also notice Hibernate examples. That is the name of the schema of the database that I've got in Hibernate. Make sure that those link up. If they don't, things aren't going to work. If you try and create and update a database that doesn't exist, those operations typically fail. So make sure you got all of that right. I got a couple of other things that are interesting in here. I've got this schema generation database action create. that will actually create database and tables, create tables in the database for me when Hibernate and JPA starts up. So there you go. Get that going. Now you'll also notice here that my persistence unit is called JPA tutorial. That is going to come in handy in just a moment. But before we get into that, let's create an entity, right? Java Persistence API is all about persisting entities. So let's create an entity to persist. I'm going to create an entity in a package called com.mcnz.jpa.examples. Why not? And then the name of the file is going to be player. So I'm setting us up for a little game that we're going to play a little later if you keep going with these tutorials. But there's just going to be a player class. Click finish there. It's not going to be too interesting. It's going to have one property that's private that nobody can see. Don't show your privates in Java. Private, it's going to be a long, and it's going to be called ID. And then there's going to be another variable, and it's going to be, it's going to represent the password, right? Just two variables here. No big deal. That ID is going to be the primary key used in the database. So you got to annotate that with an @ID annotation. Also, we need to tell MySQL to generate unique IDs for us when someone tries to persist an object that doesn't have a primary key associated with it. So to do that, you just add this generated value annotation. And now when JPA runs, if it sees that, it knows that that ID field is the primary key. And if it's empty, that it should generate one for us. Now, the other piece of the puzzle is just putting an entity annotation on that bean there. That now says this player is an entity that can be managed through the JPA Persistence Manager. So that all looks good, except for those. Do you see the red X's there? Well, there's none. There's only white X's and a red background. But either way, they're a bit annoying. You can get rid of them. You can just go source, organize imports, and boom, it brings all of those imports in. Click Control S and the errors go away. You know, one other thing I might do is I might just generate some getters and setters for that password field. Not such a bad idea. That is sort of the way that we do things in Java. I might format this a little bit to put it at the bottom there. But otherwise, this looks good. This is now an object that we would like to persist to our database. And we're going to need a table named player to handle that persistence. But we're going to leave that up to the JPA manager to take care of that for us. Now, where do we go after that? Well, let's create an application that can do our CRUD operations for us. And so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a new Java class, and I'm just going to call it the JPA CRUD example. Never know if I should uppercase or lowercase those letters there, but we'll leave it camel case like that. I'm going to add the main method in here. And in this main method, I'm going to actually call another method. I'm going to create a method that's public, static. It's going to be void, and it's just going to be called create record. Okay, just work with me here. Just going to have a method here that I can use to, well, create records in the database. And then when my program runs, I just call it. So create record will create a new record in the database. Well, it won't do anything right now because there's no code in there. So how do we get the code in there? Well, I'm actually going to do a little import. I'm going to import the Jakarta Persistence APIs right at the beginning there. And that's just going to eliminate that error message that comes up when I try and reference something in that JPA package. But to do persistence with any object, well, what you have to do is you have to call on the entity manager, which you get from the entity manager factory. You can do this all in one line of code, but I like to break it up a little bit. Entity manager factory EMF equals, and how do you get that? You get that entity manager factory by going through the persistence object and saying create entity manager factory. And we also have to add the name of the factory that we want to create in there as well. boy, I'm missing all of these letters here. And the name of the factory is actually the name of the persistence unit right here in your persistence.xml file. So I say, hey, connect to the database that's associated with that persistence unit that was listed over there in the persistence.xml file. Okay, and apparently spelling is important. So there we go. I've spelled everything correctly now. Entity manager factory. Give me a handle to all of the different entity managers. That's what I need. Next, I need an entity manager. And all you do to get an entity manager is you go through that EMF instance and say entity manager factory.create entity manager. Amazing how easy it is when you spell things correctly. And now this gives me a handle to the essentially to the persistence API. That entity manager, when it touches a Java bean, it takes care of its persistence. Of course, it has to do it within the confines of a transaction. So before we get too crazy, let's start a transaction. Entity manager .get transaction .begin. We want to begin a transaction here. Now, by the way, if you're using some crazy frameworks like, I don't know, Spring Boot or Jakarta, some CDI type magic, they'll start transactions for you when a method's called. But here, because we're doing everything by hand, we just got to create it manually. And then what you do after the transaction starts is you do something like this. You say player p equals new player. P.set password to, I don't know, ABC123, baby you and me. Isn't that a Michael Jackson song? Now we've got a player object created. And what do we want to do? We want to persist it, right? That is the C in CRUD. That is create that instance. So how do we persist it? Well, first thing we do is we have it touch the entity manager, entity manager.persist. And we pass P to the persist method of the entity manager. That essentially says the entity manager, hey, take care of this object. If anything changes with it, persist it to the database. The entity manager says, hey, that's fine with me. And then we say, okay, great. Let's do a commit. And so we get that transaction again, and then we call the commit method. And boom, I think we're done. Other than the fact that I put all of this in the wrong method there. I want that in the create record method. But there we go. That is all we need to do to create a record in our database. So I'm going to run this. I'm going to right click. I'm going to say run as a Java application. And let's see what type of magic appears when we run this application. See if all of our dreams come true. Well, it looks like something happened over here. I'm seeing a lot of JDBC stuff, but let's see what happens when we come over here to our database. Let's do a refresh. And boom, you can see we've got some tables there. Let's refresh this table, select some rows. And boom, you see a new record has been added with the password ABC123. Now, we didn't actually see any SQL in the output. I always like to see some SQL. One of the things you can do is you can add to your persistence.xml file. I like to add this in here. A couple of Hibernate properties, and the first one is Hibernate show. And then that's going to show the SQL, and then Hibernate format, and that's going to format to make it look super pretty. Now, if we add those in next time we run our code, we should actually see the SQL that is getting generated. But what are we going to do next? Well, we have just created a record. I don't know what comes after create. Retrieve. So how would we retrieve a record? Well, we've got a record here with an ID of 1. Let's comment out that method there and create a new method, public static void. You knew what was coming. Retrieve record. Did I spell it right? Retrieve record. And from here, we put in a little method. And what we want to do here is we want to pull that record with the ID of 1 out of the database. Now we're going to copy some of this code here, right? And if we want to connect to the database, we need the entity manager from the entity manager factory. We need to begin a transaction. And you know what? We probably even want to, I don't know, commit a transaction once we're done too. So I'll throw that boilerplate code in there because we kind of need that every time we go to the database. I mean, you can cache that and you know, store it in a variable or let Spring take care of it for you. But for us, we need that right now each time. But what do? Well, we just want to look up that value. So I'm going to get the key, long key equals long dot value of 1. Just do the old school way of getting a good old uppercase L long there. I could do all this in one step, but I'm just cutting it into a couple of steps to help you see how it's done. As you can see, we're looking at the record with the primary key of 1. Okay, what do we want to do after that? Well, let's get that player object that we stored there. So player P equals entity manager dot find, or as some people say, find. And what's the key? Well, the key is that key right there. We want to find an instance of the player class where the primary key is the value of the number 1. Now, how would we prove that? Well, maybe we do something like system.out.println and do p.getPassword. There's only a couple of fields in there, right? So that should work. Okay, let's see if this works. Now, I don't want to create the record again. Instead, I want to retrieve the record. So I'm going to call that method now. And let's see what happens when we run this. I'm going to right click and say run as a Java application. Notice I can actually see some of that SQL getting generated there. But what do we have? A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. Baby, you and me know that that is the value that's inside that database there. So our code is working. And also because we added that little show SQL in our persistence.xml file, we can now see the SQL that is generated in there. So that is pretty awesome. Okay, so that is working. Now, what do we do next? Okay, next, I think what we're going to do is we are going to update that record. Okay, so what's the next method we're going to create? I guess public static void update record. I'm going to get lazy here and do some copying, change that to update record. You know what we're doing. We're going to need our entity manager, going to need a transaction, going to need to close the transaction when we are done. So I'm going to put all of that in there, right there. And I don't know, how do we actually update the record? Well, you know, the update's going to look a lot like the find. So we need to find the record before we can update it. So I'm going to copy some of that code from the retrieve record. I guess I could call that method, but I want you to see all the code on the screen right there. I don't want any razzle dazzle. And what do? Well, I guess we could change the password. So p.set password. And change it to, what are we going to change it to? Oh, cowabunga, man. Okay, there we go. So we've now changed the field, changed the password of that player object. Now, notice that we don't have to do an update or anything like that. When you pull something out of the entity manager, so the entity manager pulls this out, the entity manager is going to manage the state of that object and synchronize the state of that object with the underlying database. You don't have to call the update method. As soon as that commit happens, it's going to persist the state of that object at that point in time to the database. So I'm going to click Save, Control S, and I guess I got to call that method, right? So JPA CRUD example dot, what are we doing? Oh, we're going to update the record. Looks good to me. Let's right click, say run as a Java application, and well, I don't know if we're actually going to get anything printed out, right? Oh, we get a little bit of this, hibernate that. Looks like an update and a select statement. So update, I don't see any output, but that's because I didn't cause any output to happen there. I come over here, I'm going to right click on player, select 1,000 rows, and boom, cowabunga is now the password. Now, have you had enough fun? Are you almost done with this? Would you like to kind of put an end to all of this and just delete that darn record and not think about it? Well, that would take care of the quadfecta. It's not a trifecta, it's a quadfecta. The 4 methods of the CRUD operation. So let's delete the record. Delete record, public static void, delete record. I almost said main there. Old habits die hard. Once again, we want to get all of that junk there. We want to actually get the entity manager, which is pretty fantastic at helping us out and allowing us to manage the state of an object. Okay, what do we do? I lost my way here for a second. Okay, we want to commit that transaction. You know what? We're probably, my fat fingers here are causing all sorts of problems. I'm going to grab a bunch of this code here. Okay, that is the code from the update record. Of course, if we want to delete the record, we first need to get the record. There we go. We've pulled the record down. And then what do we do at that point? Well, geez, what is the name of the method of the entity manager that will delete a record? Oh, I remember. I think it's remove. There we go. We're going to remove that object, not a remover, remove. I do have a really small keyboard that I got. My big fat fingers are hitting it all the time. Okay, we need to call that method. So JPA, CRUD example. And this example is CRUD, even though it's actually CRUD. Are we going to delete that record? Well, that's what I want to do. Now, is that record there? I want to make sure that you see that there's no razzle-dazzle here. I'm going to take a look at that table. I'm going to select 1,000 rows. There is a record there. Number 1. Let's run this code. Run as a Java application. Let it run. Let it go. Look at all of the punitive red coming up here as things get logged. I'm seeing Hibernate pushing out a delete message to me right there. Now, what's going to happen? Moment of truth right here. Select 1,000 rows and oh, big fat nulls come back because there's nothing there because that record was deleted. And there you go. That is the foundation of the JPA CRUD example. Now, obviously, we could, put all of this code into a single method that could be reused over and over again to, get the entity manager, commit transactions. And if you're using CDI, you're using Spring Boot, that's exactly what those frameworks do. But if you want to learn, that's what's going on underneath the covers when any of those frameworks hide the intimate details. Those are the intimate details right there. So from bottom to top, I'm going to scroll slowly. There's the create, there's the retrieve, there's the update, and there is the delete. This is the entity object that we used. Here's your persistence.xml. Now again, JPA tutorial, the name of that persistence unit has to map exactly to JPA tutorial right here. Let's take a look at the persistence.xml. Hibernate examples is the name of the schema that I created here, and it has to match this exactly, or the name of your database, depending on what technology you are using, what database you are using. And there's the good old POM. If you wanted to see it again, scope, compile, make sure you've got that in there. Otherwise, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Anyways, there you go. That is how easy it is to create a JDBC CRUD example using a MySQL database, JPA 3.1 and Hibernate, and a little bit of MySQL database, Eclipse, JDK 21, all of that good stuff. Now, If you enjoyed that tutorial, why don't you head over to theserverside.com. I'm the editor-in-chief over there. We've got lots of great tutorials on JPA, JDBC, database management, you name it. Lots of Java stuff too. Lots of Spring. If you're interested in my personal antics, why don't you follow me over on Twitter? And I would even throw this out here. Why don't you subscribe on YouTube?